Hello, my name's Julian Savulescu. I'm the Director of the Collective Responsibility for Infectious Disease program at the Oxford Martin School, and welcome to tonight's event. It's a great pleasure to welcome back Dr. Anne Schwenkenbecher. Anne is going to present her book, Getting Our Act Together, Collective Moral Obligations. Anne is a senior lecturer in philosophy in the College of Arts, Business Law and Social Sciences at Murdoch University in Western Australia. But more importantly than that, she was an Oxford Martin visiting fellow at our program for infectious disease a couple of years back, where she did the bulk of this important work. And before joining Murdoch University in 2013, she had appointments at the University of Melbourne, the Centre for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at Australian National University, the University of Vienna and Potsdam University. In addition to the current book, she's also author of Terrorism, A Philosophical Inquiry. So just a couple of housekeeping announcements. This talk is being recorded. There will be a Q&A at the end, and we'll talk for about 25 minutes. And then I'll ask her a couple of questions, and then we'll turn over to the audience for Q&A. But if you'd like to ask a question, you must be watching via Crowdcast and then click on the Ask a Question button at the bottom right-hand side of the screen, not the chat function. So without further ado, Anne, take it away.
Thank you, Julian. Can everybody see the PowerPoint? Yeah?
No, I can't.
You can't see it? Just checking. Clara, can you see the PowerPoint?
No, I can't see it at the moment. What there is a black screen. Have you pressed the slideshow part of the PowerPoint?
Yes, I have. So let me just...
Oh, there it is. Yeah.
You can see it now?
Yes. Yeah.
It's on. Yeah.
And now you can still.
Now it's gone.
Okay, so interesting. So it looks like when I press the slideshow button, it disappears.
We can see it like that, though. So if you leave it like that, we can see it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Great. I want to start by thanking Julian Savulescu and the Oxford Martin School for hosting this virtual book launch. I'm very much indebted to Julian and the Oxford Martin School when it comes to this book, because large parts of the book were written while I was an Oxford Martin visiting fellow in 2017, 2018. And I was an actual physical fellow there, not just a virtual one, as part of the research program on collective responsibility for infectious diseases. And that research stint and the interactions with people at the Oxford Martin School and the Your Hero Centre for Practical Ethics have had a huge impact on my research on this topic. And I look back very fondly to the time spent at the Oxford Martin School, not least because I haven't left Australia in nearly a year and a half. So what this book is about in a nutshell, together we can often achieve things that are impossible to do on our own. We can prevent something bad from happening, or we can produce something good even if none of us could do it by ourselves. These are a special type of collective action problem. They are collective moral action problems, and they can be quite puzzling. To think of some of our obligations as collective is, in my view, the best way of solving the puzzles that collective moral action problems generate. And in trying to answer the question of when we should get our act together, in this book I start with small-scale, one-off cooperation problems and ultimately turn to our obligations to collectively combat large-scale systemic injustice. I want to start with an example from around the corner. And literally, it's from just around the corner from me and the Perth-based audience today, and it's virtually around the corner for most of you. On 7 August 2014, on a busy weekday morning at Stirling Station in Perth in Western Australia, a man got trapped between the commuter train and the station's platform. If the train had moved, he would have been crushed. He had his leg trapped between the train and the platform, but dozens of people who happened to be on the platform at the time saw his predicament and joined forces and actually managed to push that train aside. They tilted it just enough to free the trapped man. Now, it is obvious that none of these people could have helped the trapped man on their own. In order to assist him, they had to collaborate, and collaborate they did. So for each of the individual commuters, they obviously had to think about whether or not they were going to contribute and what they were going to do in this situation. So each of the commuters could have reasoned in the following way. They could have said to themselves, well, my contribution may or may not make a difference to the outcome. I think I have an obligation only if I actually make a difference to the outcome. So that means I may or may not have an obligation to contribute, since it's not clear that I will make that difference. But it's quite unlikely that my contribution or my failure to contribute are going to make a difference, because after all, I'm just one out of very many people who could take action here. And it's unclear that I will necessarily be the difference maker. This kind of reasoning is what is called I-mode reasoning. I-mode reasoning is a type of best response reasoning where the individual deliberating agent starts from her own position, her ability to make a difference. Her decision on how to act depends on what she believes others will do and what therefore the optimal response is. As we've seen above, it's likely to mean that in the kind of scenario like the one that we just discussed, the individual person may conclude that it's unlikely that her response in particular is going to make a difference, and therefore she's not under no obligation to contribute. After all, if there are sufficiently many others already contributing, then her contribution is not needed. And if there are very few others contributing, then it may well be pointless for her to contribute. Now, there's obvious problems with this approach. For instance, it's somewhat unclear in these scenarios what really the best response to others' actions is, because we don't necessarily know whether or not we're going to make a difference. So this kind of reasoning may not provide what we call in philosophy clear action guidance. Further, what I've just said is also true for every single commuter on the platform. If everybody employs this kind of reasoning, then we may end up not doing anything. We may end up with no one contributing, because each commuter can reason that her contribution is not necessary for producing the desired outcome. It wouldn't be her failure to contribute which undermines the collective cause. After all, her failure could always be compensated by any of the other undecided or unwilling agents. So there are no strong reasons for her to contribute if she merely employs I-mode reasoning. And that is true for every single agent at the scene. Some might even think that this is a bit of a reductio ad absurdum of I-mode reasoning. If we follow such a pattern of reasoning in those kinds of scenarios, we end up with an undesirable, counterintuitive result. No one has strong reasons to contribute. But as it happened, in our exemplary case, people did help. They made their contribution and they collectively succeeded in tilting the train just enough to free the trapped commuter. This suggests that people were reasoning not in I mode, but in what we call we mode. In we mode, individual choices are seen as contributions to what is the collectively best option. Options or outcomes that are only collectively available are included in moral deliberation. That is, I don't just think of my options as the options that are directly available to me as an individual, but I also include options that are available to us as a group of people. So here's how the commuter would be deliberating in we mode. they might think, well, looking at the scenario, there's 3 possibilities or 3 options. The first one is that there's a sufficiently large subgroup of people who push against the train, tilted, and free the trapped man. Second option is that we all just go our own way and do nothing. And the third option is that some of us try, but the numbers aren't great enough to make a significant difference. And clearly, out of these 3 options, the first option, where sufficiently many of us try, that is the best option, because that is the one where we can secure the outcome of securing the trapped man. So that would be an example of we reasoning. And the we reasoner would then therefore accept or infer that they should take steps towards realizing the best option, the optimal option, which in this case is the first option. For instance, by encouraging others to push a train against the train together with them. So this reasoning schema works in cases where there's no certainty as to exactly how many people are required to contribute and where decisions have to be made simultaneously by potential contributors. This will often be the case in large-scale collective action cases, and it's certainly true for our specific case here. So note that we reasoning really involves these 2 steps. It involves first what we call reframing. Reframing means to include collectively available options in one's option set when deliberating about which option is best and identifying an option that is only collectively available as optimal. In the second step, the deliberating agent determines her individual course of action as playing her part in the collectively optimal course of action. And if this is how the individual bystander reasons about what she should do, then she is employing we reasoning. So reframing, the first step here, is just means that we, when we think about what to do, include options that are only collectively available. We may do so to the exclusion of the individual perspective, giving greater weight to the collective option over the individual one, or we may actually consider both simultaneously. There are many collective action scenarios where by default, many of us would reason in this particular way. Not only would we include collectively available options, but we would also, in fact, take individual steps towards realizing those options. So this may include communicating our intentions and goals to others, asking them to contribute, distributing, coordinating tasks. So we do this all the time. We act collectively all the time, and we play our role and contribute to collective tasks all the time. Just think of something really standard like setting a table, for instance. One of us might start setting the table and the other one just joins in, or one of us might start lifting, carrying a piece of furniture and the other one just joins in. Or think of a scenario where somebody, can't get into a bus because they have a heavy pram. Often what happens, somebody will just, without even talking much, will just sort of lend a hand, and then together they will lift the pram into a tram and will intuitively adopt their individual contributory roles towards the joint goal. So in many cases, in a social context, individual roles will be clear quite from the start. This will usually be the case where there is a habitual pattern of action for a particular joint endeavor. Or one example was setting a table, another one, as I just said, helping to lift something like a pram, or think about a traditional dance or tune that people know well enough to just join in. There's not much, we don't need to think about that much. Or some of us might if you're a bit shy. Okay, so it is important to note that we employ both types of reasoning, the I mode and the we mode, depending on the circumstances, and one, depending again on the circumstances, may be considered more appropriate than the other. And which one is more appropriate often depends on the context. I'm not claiming that one of these types of reasoning is better than the other, but just pointing out that we can and do approach collective action problems in 2 very fundamentally different ways. There's obviously a natural tension between these 2 approaches, the tension between seeing ourselves as the individual autonomous agents that we are, and being aware at the same time of our social nature, the fact that we could not exist with others, without others, that we collaborate with others, that we participate in joint endeavors, that we rely on others and trust others all the time. So we're essentially social creatures, and we often simultaneously see ourselves as social and individual. And this tension is expressed in the tension between I mode and we mode thinking. Now, what does all of this have to do with collective obligations, the topic of my book? In the most general sense, our moral obligations are imperatives to perform certain actions or produce certain outcomes. Some morally important outcomes can't be produced by individuals acting in isolation, or where they're undesirable, they can't be prevented by individuals acting in isolation. We have to coordinate our actions, cooperate with others to achieve those outcomes. Regularly, in order to produce such outcomes, individual deliberating agents will have to employ we mode reasoning. So here is the brief version of the account that I defend in the book of collective obligations. In the book, I argue that a set of agents as a collective moral obligation if there exists a specific morally significant collective action problem such that the agents can collectively but not individually address that problem. Secondly, conscientious moral deliberation leads those agents to believe that some collectively available options for action is morally optimal with regard to addressing that problem. So the people in the particular set we're looking at, either all or a sufficiently large subset of them come to believe that the optimal option for action in the scenario is one that is collectively available. And thirdly, those agents are in a position to determine their individual or joint strategies to enact that option. So they are in a position where they can figure out what they individually need to do in order to realize the joint option that they have decided is optimal. So we can clearly see that in the case of our commuters, it was a scenario where people quickly realized that everybody pushing against the train to tilt it to increase that gap that the commuter was trapped in, that was the best option. And then it was very easy to say that obviously that would involve each of them tilting or pushing against the train to tilt. So that's obviously a very, very basic example of collective action where the individual course of action is really clear. Collective actions obviously give rise to individual contributory obligations. If we together have a collective obligation and we each have an individual obligation to do something. Now that something can be a physical contribution to an outcome, as in the case of the commuters tilting the train, but it can also be an epistemic act. For instance, it can involve reassuring myself that my immediate contribution is not needed right now, but that I should stay put for later. So in this scenario, it might be important that I don't intervene or I don't contribute, but hold back and see if my contribution is required. We should also keep in mind that considerations in favor of collective action can and regularly will conflict with considerations in favor of individual action. So this tension can't be completely resolved, but the idea is that my theory should encourage us to see that we mode deliberation and collective obligation are on a par with their individualist counterparts. That is, I mode deliberation and individual moral obligations. That means they are on a par at the explanatory level and also the conceptual level. That is, we just see them as another type of obligations that exist in their own right, just like the individual obligations that philosophy has traditionally focused on. One can easily see the parallels between the small-scale cases of cooperation that I started from and the larger-scale collective moral action problems. Think about reducing greenhouse gas emissions in order to limit global warming. Think about increasing vaccination rates. Think about changing to a plant-based diet to slow down environmental degradation and lessen animal suffering. Now let us look at the larger picture again. It is fair to say that traditionally philosophy has been very focused on the individual as the basic unit of agency, rationality, knowledge, and belief, as well as moral accountability and responsibility. In fact, one of our colleagues, one of Julian's colleagues, my colleagues, Neil Levy, wrote that with few exceptions, work on moral responsibility in the Anglophone world is resolutely individualistic. And for the most part, individualism is taken for granted to such an extent that philosophers are no more aware of their individualism than fish are of the water in which they swim. That's Neil Levy's assessment. It is fair to say that this fairly narrow outlook that Neil is describing is currently receiving a thorough conceptual shake-up. And in fact, that shake-up has been ongoing for several decades now. What started out as a perhaps more niche position, a non-reductive collectivism in action theory and moral theory, is increasingly becoming more accepted, but still a long way from being a mainstream approach, it is fair to say. If we conceive of individuals as the only units of agency, rationality and moral accountability in the social world, in my view, we will not only fail to fully recognize and understand facts about ourselves and our social world, but we will likely forgo opportunities to harness the enormous potential that collective agency harbors for effecting positive change in the world. It is perhaps no coincidence, though, that this individualist focus has persisted for such a long time, and not just in philosophy, it really should be said. It is conceptually really difficult to reconcile the dual perspective we can have on our lives as individual agents on the one hand, and as social beings who live, act, and thrive only in groups on the other hand. So in this book, I not only try to show how we can expand traditional moral theory to incorporate collectivism, but also argue that such an approach better reflects how deeply collectivism is ingrained in our everyday thinking and moral practice. Collective moral action problems are intriguing because our intuitive or standard responses vary greatly depending on the specific features of a situation. While we all accept that together with others we have greater capacities than on our own, and that bundling those capacities will often lead to better outcomes, we regularly feel torn between participating in the collective effort of choosing what is individually efficacious, but perhaps collectively suboptimal. In those cases, traditional moral theory is often at a loss, as yet we lack the adequate conceptual tools. So therefore, this book tries to provide us with those tools to better understand our obligations in collective action cases. I don't posit a new type of moral obligation. Rather, I hope to make the reader of my book realize that many of our existing obligations and the way we intuitively perceive of them are in an important sense collective. So I see my task as providing a conceptual account of something that is already part of our moral practice and deliberation. And when I started writing the book, I had obviously a couple of examples in mind, and in the most unfortunate way, the real world has provided the best example I could have had for my theory, namely the global pandemic. Right now, we all know the world is in the grip of a pandemic caused by a highly contagious and often deadly virus. Different countries' responses to COVID-19 are telling, and they're telling not just of the political aptitude of their leaders, but of the communal spirit they invoke or fail to invoke. Each to their own approach is failing abysmally, while those leaders and officials who appeal to the collective nature of the task at hand and encourage people to think of health as a public rather than a private good show impressive results in beating the pandemic. And of course, in doing so, what these leaders do in framing the issue this way, they're doing nothing else but reframing and re-reasoning. So this example shows that even large-scale collective action and global change are ultimately not successful without action at the local, communal, and interpersonal levels. Combating the pandemic requires coherent government action, as well as people actually making everyday sacrifices, changing their behavior, looking out for others, and taking action beyond what is legally required of them. And I'm coming to my very last slide here. So when should we get our act together to affect change in the world? The message of the book is clear and it is positive. We together can have obligations to affect change at the large and the small scale, even if our individual actions by themselves seem inconsequential. Thank you. That's the end of the presentation. So I will try.
Thanks very much, Anne. That was fascinating. I agree with everything that you've said. So I'm just going to ask 3 questions just to get the discussion off. And so I'm playing the devil's advocate here. So the first question is, I want to try and bring this I mode reasoning and we mode reasoning together. So the example that you gave of the train is a fairly simple one, because it involves, a 2 to 3 minute effort of people to push on the train, and the person will be released and they can go about their business. It doesn't really impose any great costs on them to act together. But one of the features of collective action problems is that the costs of bringing about some outcome that is collectively valuable, like herd immunity, are different for different people. So consider vaccination. So COVID-19, as everyone knows now, is mainly a disease of the elderly. 90% of the people who die are over the age of 65. So the costs of being vaccinated for an elderly person to contribute to herd immunity are zero. Actually, it's a net benefit to them. But if you're 20 years old, you've got more chance of being killed in a car accident than dying of COVID-19. So the costs of being vaccinated are taking on the known risks and possibly unknown risks of vaccination. So the costs for the younger person of engaging in this collective action sacrifice are much higher. So should we take that into account when making decisions about our collective duties, or should we just have a one size fits all and we're all in this together and everyone needs to be vaccinated to realise herd immunity?
Yeah, thanks, Julian. So I haven't really said much about what level of cost we're required to take on with regard to vaccination or any other issues. So that's obviously a question that is the same for individual obligations and collective obligations, because whenever we have a moral obligation, that obligation will have to can only sort of be required of us if it's within a certain reasonable level of costliness to us. So that question arises not just for collective obligations, it arises as sort of generally for all our obligations to see, well, what is the cost to the individual and is that too demanding, right? So different moral theories will usually give us different answers as to how demanding really morality is on us. And people have reacted to that, some obviously by saying, oh, no one's required to be a moral saint. There's certain things that, you should try your best, but you can't do, everything to constantly make the world a better place. In the vaccination case, it's quite interesting when you gave the examples of the costs in particular and the benefits. So I think here it's probably worth also widening the focus a little bit and to see that the benefits are obviously not just at the individual level of the vaccination, but they are at the collective level for all age groups. So obviously the individualized benefit of the vaccine is the immediate health outcome for the individual, so that I'm protected or I'm less likely to be hospitalized or die from this particular disease. But there's other collective benefits or social benefits from having high vaccination rates that for instance, that our societies can open up again, that life can start again, that people can go to their work again, that businesses don't have to stay closed. And those benefits, I would think, are really distributed. So perhaps here too, we can sort of almost do the same exercise and say, well, can we just look at the collective scale of this? And in that sense, I think young people have a really strong reason to make their contribution, because we know we won't be able to return to anything close to life as usual or business as usual, and life as we knew it without having a certain level of vaccination rates in the population. I hope that answers.
No, I think that's a very good answer. So I just have two other brief questions, then we'll throw it open to the audience. So the second one is not when there's a great sacrifice required or a considerable sacrifice. The other one is where meeting your obligation is pointless. So I'll give you another example from COVID. So one of my favourite activities during COVID was to buy a table tennis table and start playing table tennis. And I was playing with one of my colleagues. And then Boris Johnson brought in a lockdown sometime in December where he could no longer come over and play table tennis. But I've had COVID and have immunity. I know I have antibodies, and he'd been vaccinated. So actually, there was no risk to anyone of him coming over and playing table tennis, and I wanted him to come over and play table tennis. But my wife said that we couldn't break the rules, and of course, I'd never break the rules as a professor of ethics. But in many cases, people will reason there is no point to me making this contribution because it's futile. Not only it clearly won't make a difference in this case. So surely I can be exempt from my obligation to contribute if it really will make no difference. And people often reason this way to get out of meeting their obligations. Do you think people can be exempt from their collective obligations when their contribution clearly is futile?
So that's really interesting. So I thought in this particular case that you presented you were basically the victim of a rule that was so general that it should have allowed probably for people like you who are vaccinated to gather. So in a way that was probably just the sort of those rules need to, in order to be simple, probably can't come with too many exemptions. Right. But I do think, so here's another way of looking at it, and that's where the argument in the book had to sort of become a bit more complex. My argument here with cases where it really looks like we don't make a difference, and to be honest, with a lot of the individual take greenhouse gas emission reductions, that's an example where it doesn't really make a difference as if for any particular trip that I take, I use my car or walk. No, it doesn't, right? It doesn't for that particular trip. And the problem is that it doesn't make a difference for any of the individual actions I take. So we have a clear case where it just looks like, well, individually, these or by themselves are taken in isolation, these things make no difference. The way I look at it is to say that is true for all these actions that individuals take everywhere across the world. However, as it turns out, in aggregation, they do make a difference. So to conclude then that it doesn't morally matter what I do because individually in isolation it makes no difference can be seen as a kind of a reductio of the view that difference making is the only thing that matters for our obligations. In these particular cases, it's not difference making of the individual contribution that matters, because if it did, it would turn out that none of us had an obligation to do anything at all, and that would obviously be morally suboptimal. So that's kind of the argument that I use in the book. It's kind of a reductio of the view that difference making is the only thing that counts, because then in collective action scenarios, we always run into this problem. However, I'm not sure that entirely matches your particular case, because if you had 100 or 1,000 people who are all vaccinated or all immune, then it wouldn't make a difference if they all play table tennis. So here the reason must be found in something else, namely in the pure practical benefit from keeping political messaging simple and not to allow for too many exemptions. That would be one way in which one could end that.
Last question is, what about where I don't reason from the I mode, I reason from the we mode and disagree with what somebody else is claiming we have a moral obligation to do? So just to take your example, that we should all move to a plant-based diet to reduce animal suffering. So let's just take the animal suffering part. So let's assume I have the view that it's better that animals exist and have happy lives and are killed painlessly to provide meat than they don't exist because everyone is eating a plant-based diet. So I have this moral position that we should have humane, happy animals for farming rather than no animals and a plant-based diet. So that's my moral view. So I morally disagree with the so-called collective obligation. Am I then required to meet that collective obligation? I'm a kind of conscientious objector, really, to the sort of collective moral obligation.
No, so you're not on my theory. On my theory, it is the group of people who have reason to assume that a particular option is morally optimal, and where there is reasonable disagreement about whether or not an option is optimal, then it basically falls flat in that sense. So where there is reasonable disagreement, you could say the people, you could argue or not whether this is a case of reasonable disagreement, but one could also say, well, if you see the option of improving animals' welfare as sort of the optimal option, and the better option over having no animal product consumption at all, then you, together with a set of agents who see that as optimal, would probably then have an obligation to work towards improving animal welfare and well-being. So yeah, but you could see how different groups would pursue different goals here where there's reasonable disagreement. And I haven't really come down on in my book on what the correct view of this is. This is an example where a lot of people intuitively agree, but there may be a lot of room for reasonable disagreement there.
Okay, you've got 10 questions now. Do you want to have a look through and see which one you want to address first?
Yeah, let me just see where I need to click in order to bring up the questions.
Ask the question thing down the bottom of your screen. If you click that.
Yep, unanswered questions. Okay, yeah, great.
The top votes are at the top.
Okay, top 10. Do I mode reasoning and we mode reasoning apply to countries in international perspective? Yeah, so if the question is meant to say do agents like states, can they also adopt different reasoning modes? Yeah, that's definitely the case. So if we look at if we think of states as moral agents, and a lot of philosophers these days tend to do that, they think of states as agents that can act on the basis of moral principles. They can deliberate, their governments can deliberate, their leaders can deliberate, and as such, they can make decisions based on moral principles. So obviously, when it comes to making decisions, for instance, about climate change, there's also different options they can take. And we can see in the international climate debate, very often countries will adopt clearly what we would call an I mode stance. They will say, well, we're not making a difference, so we shouldn't contribute. In fact, unfortunately, Australia has been adopting this stance very openly in international climate negotiations. They say, well, our emissions in the grand scheme of things are so small, therefore we're, it doesn't matter, or it's less important, or that we comply with those obligations, or we shouldn't be seen as a leader, or we're excused from not being a leader. So rather than seeing this as a collective endeavour to which Australians should contribute, they've seen it as, again, through the lens of IMO reasoning and as difference making. And they've argued, well, if I don't make a difference in this particular case in Australia, in the grand scheme of things, maybe it doesn't make such a big difference, then we shouldn't be at least sort of leaders in this field. And obviously they have then deferred to China and the US. So that's the question by Trin. Julian, should I just scroll through the questions, or do you want to pick a particular one that you...
Why don't we go to the next top one? I've had a quick scroll through, so why don't you do the top one, and then I'll look for another one while you're talking.
So here is a question that says, self-identity then would seem to be a key aspect in developing a collectivist culture to address global environmental and social crises. What are your thoughts on ways to steward transformation of self-identity? This is a really, really great question. So I'm not a social psychologist, but I am aware that social psychologists have looked into, or have been looking into, this question for decades of what it means to what social identities are, what group identities are, and what factors determine those. So I have in my book referenced some of that work. There's people like Christina Bicchieri too, who work on social norms and the way we can change them. And there's some very interesting insights that she and other and social psychologists have brought to the fore. So one of the aspects that I found very interesting is that sort of non-social behavior or negative examples sort of spread more strongly than some positive examples or social behavior. So that would be one thing to keep in mind when we see public information campaigns, but also other attempts at motivating people. People will more likely copy negative behavior, but they will copy positive behavior if they have the sense that the people who display the positive behavior are part of their own cultural group, or they identify in a way with them. So yeah, that seems to be absolutely crucial. Now, obviously, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and foment a collective identity that denies all individualism, but certainly in formulating the problem and framing it publicly some of these global action problems in a ways that gives people the sense that we're all in the same boat, that we need to act together, that this is a collective goal. I think that's absolutely crucial in motivating people to act. And we've seen our governments do that also with a pandemic. The Western Australian government has had this public health announcement where they kept saying, we're all in this together. Remember, we can only get through this together, so please do the following. So then they would come with their individual recommendations, but they clearly tried to frame it as a collective issue and try to get into people a sense of doing this together and being in this together. I hope that answers the question somewhat.
So the next popular question is lefty.
Chris, thank you for the question, Chris. Does your project have meta-ethical presuppositions? Might certain meta-ethical theories be consistent with the existence of individual but not of collective moral obligations? I don't think so. I think it is meta-ethically perfectly neutral. But I also admit that I haven't thought about this very much. So at the first glance, though, I just can't see how it would be meta-ethically compromised, so to speak. I'm happy to think more about it or talk to you more about it. But right now, I would say no, it doesn't have any meta-ethical presuppositions.
Okay. So next one, a couple of rounds. Ollie Blomberg has 4 votes.
Yeah. Hi, Ola. In the book, you mentioned that collective moral obligations may not only be grounded in the existence of a morally significant collective action problem, but also in considerations of fairness. Each could achieve the whole morally best outcome on their own, but given that we could share the burden fairly, we nevertheless have a collective moral obligation to do it. Do you think such collective moral obligations involve reasons for reframing and reasoning as well? Yeah, that's a very interesting one. Thanks, Ola. I actually don't talk about that in the book as much. I do mention it though. So yes. So let's just say we have cases for actions that we could perform on our own or together with others. Let's just say we can move. There's a heavy piece of furniture that I could move individually, or you could help me move it. Now, it would seem that in that scenario, it might be a recommendation of fairness that you help me move it. And we might even see when there's no other reasons to favor me moving it over you moving it, that naturally it should fall to us together, even though strictly speaking, it's not a collective action problem. I can move the table by myself, but let's just say somebody requires us to move the table, or let's just say somebody is trapped under the table, just to use that same kind of example again, then it looks like naturally it would be something that we should share. Yes, I agree. And then that would be a collective obligation on us. These are a bit different from the ones I looked at in the book, because in the book I really focused only on cases that where we have to collaborate, those joint necessity cases. But these other cases where we could collaborate, but we don't have to, they can also generate collective obligations, yes.
Okay, I think the next one is from Mark Cooper, near the top, under Tess's.
Yeah, hi Mark. Does your book address the question of how to make a choice when we are unsure as to whether I mode or we mode reasoning is the most appropriate choice in a particular circumstance? Yes, it does, but there is no clear-cut sort of answer or kind of, follow through, easy to follow recipe for deciding that. Basically, what I say that it really depends on how the options are being ranked. So if I see, for instance, if I see the commuter train, in the commuter train scenario, if I see that there's only 3 people on the platform, then I might conclude that the better option here is for one of us to, call whatever the station attendant, to call an ambulance, to call the firefighters or whoever could help in that scenario. So in that case, then I would not rank the collective option highest. I would rank an individually available option highest. And sometimes it might be unclear between the two, which one is to be ranked highest. And that can really undermine collective obligations. So if you have good reason to rank an individually available option highest, while I have good reason to think the collectively available option is highest, then this might mean that we don't end up having a collective obligation because we reasonably disagree on what is the best thing in the scenario. Having said that, if I think the collective option is best or should rank highest, then I have additional reason to try to seek out contributors. So I would have reason to convince you, for instance, to talk to you and say, well, look at this, look at that. So, deliberation would be implied, or the requirement to negotiate and to communicate would be implied by the obligations in that scenario. I hope that answers your question.
So I think Jose at the bottom has
Tess Johnson's question, is that what you said, Julian?
No? Jose at the bottom. He's now at the top. He's got two votes.
Okay, Jose. Hi, Jose. Thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on epistemic acts. Yeah, so what I meant in that particular scenario, I meant is that you might just have to make an effort to convince yourself of certain facts, or to find certain things out about the situation. So what I had in mind were the following kinds of scenarios. We can imagine a scenario where 4 people need to collaborate to lift a very heavy piano. There's 5 people present, and really you can't do it with 5 people, because then it would be just so awkward. It's just in fact, it's counterproductive if the 5th person contributes. Now, I don't want to say that in those scenarios 4 people have a collective obligation and 1 person has no obligation. What I'm saying is 5 people have an obligation, but everybody must ensure that, or must figure out if they actually need to physically contribute. So for instance, if it's 5 of us and I see you and 3 other people lifting the piano, then I can sort of ascertain for myself that the problem is taken care of. So now I have the right belief, I have formed the right belief that assures me that I don't, even though I have an obligation here, I don't need to actually physically act. But I do still need to keep an eye on you. And when somebody says, Anne, can you just take over because, whatever, this is getting too heavy for me, then I must be ready and there. Let's say if I went into the opposite room and didn't know whether the 4 of you were actually okay lifting the piano, then I would not be discharging my epistemic obligation, because I would prevent myself from forming informed beliefs about whether or not you guys are okay lifting the piano. So the epistemic act that I would be required to do in this scenario would be to come out and look and check that you guys, the 4 of you, are actually okay lifting the piano. So I hope that helps. Thanks.
I think Alex towards the bottom.
Alex McCall, yes, I see the question. I want to address morality as a project of human improvement. What do you propose should happen to those who can't or don't fulfill their collective moral obligations correctly and remain morally unregenerate? Does the onus fall on them to be coerced into moral improvement, or you or others to create better theories and frameworks? Well, thanks, first of all, that you think that I would be one of the people who are morally more compliant than others. What would we do with people who are not meeting their obligations? So I have very little to say about that, actually, because in the end, the theory that I develop is really about shifting the focus when it comes to obligations from the individual to groups and sets of agents. It's not, there's no recommendations for, and in fact, philosophers are really quite impotent when it comes to the question of how do we get people to comply. That probably is best a question for moral psychologists or social psychologists. Philosophers deal more with, I guess, the question what our obligations are, rather than how do we get people to fulfill them. Having said that, there's a really interesting question, I think, embedded in your question, and that is the question of partial compliance or free riding or defecting. So let's say we have this piano situation and, 4 people could lift the piano, but maybe 3 people will do, but it's just harder on everyone. Is it okay if I just walk off, or is there any onus on me, or is there any residual obligation if I just go like, well, you guys can do it on your own, it's going to be a bit harder for you if I don't do my share, but that's okay. And in fact, we see a similar scenario in climate change to some extent, where many countries have not been meeting their obligations to reduce their emissions. And the question could be put whether or not other countries who have more willing governments and a more willing population perhaps to reduce emissions should take up the slack. Should they do more than what would be fair to require of them because others don't do their share? And I argue, not in this book particularly, but I have said in the past that in certain situations it would be the right thing to take up the slack left by others. but only in situations that are, obviously very urgent. I hope that answers the questions. Thanks, Alex.
Okay, we're almost time. There are two questions at the bottom that deal with political solutions and political philosophy. Do you want to try and take both of those together, Roger Burrett and Alexa Zelenton?
Yeah, okay. I take Roger's question first. Must political solutions dominate philosophical solutions about collective action in practice? Okay. Now, I have to admit, I'm not really sure how to interpret that question. What I will do is I'll take Alexa's question first, and Roger, if you wanted to reformulate your question, then I can come back to it afterwards, because right now I'm not entirely sure what you're getting at. So if you can type in a comment perhaps to help me understand it. I'm just moving to the next question, Alexa Zelentine. Hi, Alexa. Hi, Anne. Thanks for the wonderful introduction. I got caught up on the aspect of we mode, where we take options into account that are beyond the reach of individuals but can only be realized collectively. Does this mean that political philosophy is dealing with questions that by their nature always involve collective actions must predominantly happen in we mode? Political philosophy must predominantly... yeah, okay. Again, I just have to think about how this question is meant. So I guess political philosophy in its approach deals with questions that certainly are relevant to we mode thinking. But I thought of political philosophy. Political philosophy to me also had a bit of a gap in it, or let's just say what I'm trying to do with this theory perhaps is fill a gap between political philosophy and traditional moral theory. Traditional moral theory has looked at, again, individuals and how they ought to act and what their obligations are and how they ought to deliberate. Now, political philosophy often looks at how society should be organized, how what justice is, what just institutions are, what kinds of things should be improved in society and how society should ideally be structured. So, and I see a gap between those because there's a lot of things that sort of can be said about, I guess, collective action to affect those changes, where that collective action goes beyond what perhaps individualist moral theory focused on, but is perhaps less than what political philosophy has traditionally focused on. I hope that that somewhat answers.
Maybe I can kind of just give you my take on these questions.
Absolutely.
So, what is paradigmatic about collective action problems is people tend to free ride, so they tend to try to avoid making the sacrifice and benefit from the collective good. And so the way in which these problems are typically dealt with are through either attaching disincentives or incentives to meeting those obligations. So the commonest example is speeding. It's in my interests to speed and everyone else doesn't speed. So what we do is we impose penalties which align self-interest with morality. So it then becomes in my interest to avoid the cost of the fine and drive in the speed limit. So do you think in the end that our collective moral obligations can only be realised politically through creating either disincentives through the fines or other mandatory coercive policies or through incentives? So do we need political solutions to these as a way of actually getting people to behave, to meet their collective obligations?
Yeah, thanks for the translation. That is a question that I've addressed in the book. So it absolutely makes it easier, of course, if there is a coordinated effort. And in imposing fines, for instance, we're shifting the individual payoff. So even on an I mode frame, we will change the way people weigh the different options. So I guess what I'm getting at here is that where these political solutions do not yet exist, There is a bit of a vacuum, obviously, but that perhaps we should, there's still the possibility of seeing our obligations there as collective, and therefore, I guess, motivating, and I guess that can motivate people to contribute even when those political solutions are not there. Because the political solution that you mentioned, regulation, legislation, it really shifts us almost back to an individualist focus, because now it is in my interest to avoid a fine, etc. So again, and that does make it easier, right? So it makes it easier for people to decide, because often that's just sort of intuitively, that's the one thing I have control over. Well, I don't have control over collective solutions. I want to say that's not all there is. It's not the case that without political solutions, there's no obligations whatsoever. We can still contribute and still have obligation to contribute to collective endeavors, even when legislations and regulations are not yet there to impose on us.
Fantastic. I'm sorry, we're going to have to stop there. What a timely presentation. There couldn't have been a more important and relevant presentation to the predicament that we find ourselves in. Press the green button down there and buy the book. I can urge you all that you'll find it fascinating reading. But please join me in thanking Anne for a really lively and interesting and philosophically rich presentation. Everyone's I can assure you. Look at all the lovely comments you've got. Thanks very much, Anne, and thank you all for sitting through the sort of virtual discussion.
Okay, thanks, Julian. I'll see you soon. Bye.